Copy that. Hey, what's up? What's up, Bree? How you doing today?
I'm good. How are you today?
I'm good. Good. Happy to be here. Very excited to dig into this conversation today. Happy to meet with our audience. Thank you, everybody, for coming out and joining us. So, with that said, I'll just introduce myself. So, I'm Darren, a content strategist here with Push Black.
And I'm Bree. I'm a writer at Pushback.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for joining us.
All right. So, today we are actually going to be discussing police misconduct payouts. Now, policing is really draining our society, so many different reasons. And ostensibly, we're really funding our own oppression through so-called misconduct payouts. But what we really, really need to understand is that misconduct and racism is the nature of all policing. It's not an exception. So with that said, today we're going to break down the ins and outs of what it means when folks say we want to defund the police. But before we get into that, let's have a little bit of background around these police misconduct payouts. Bree, if you could share with the folks, how much money do police departments spend on misconduct payouts every year?
Yeah, so according to the Washington Post, there are nearly 40,000 documented payments over a 10-year period involving allegations of police misconduct in 25 departments. So quite a lot. And Darren, do you want to guess how much the total amount is?
Okay, study was done across 10 years, 25 departments, 800 million, maybe a billion, something like that. What are we looking at?
Closer with the billion. So actually it's totaling over 3 billion. So in cities like New York, Chicago, and LA alone, they accounted for the bulk of these overall payments, documented by the Post. And that was more than 2.5 billion. So it's quite a lot. It's a bit mind blowing. And we're going to dig into some more cities. Do you want to tell them about Chicago and some of the others?
Yes, yes. Let's get into Chicago. So, Chicago from 2010 to 2020, they spilled about $528 million of taxpayer money, y'all, our money, to resolve police misconduct claims. Now, out of that 528 million, 72% of those offenses were committed by officers named in multiple payments. So we see these are repeat offenses, right? Thinking along those lines, let's take a look at Philadelphia. In Philly, just 6 officers in one narcotics unit, they generated 173 lawsuits, y'all. And this costs about $6.5 million in total. You know, the cherry on top, in 2014, those same officers were actually federally charged with theft, arrest, and other heinous crimes. But of course, they were eventually acquitted at trial. And lastly, I just want to raise up New York as well, right? One of the epicenters of police violence and misconduct. So in New York, more than 5,000 officers were named in 2 or more claims, and that accounted for more than 45% of the money the city spent on misconduct cases. Now, the data provided by cities didn't include any demographic information around the victims or the persons who actually filed the claims. But Chicago attorney Mark Parts, who's very familiar with handling these lawsuits, he's handled scores of these things, he actually shared that the folks who are aggressively policed and confronted by officers in the course of their daily lives too often are actually people of color, as we know. And
Yeah.
from Mark Parts, he says himself that he's seen the majority of those rights the majority of those whose rights are repeatedly violated are African Americans and Latinx persons. So we know who this misconduct actually targets, and we actually have to pay for it. But thinking about who actually has to pay for it, Bree, I wonder if you could share with us a little bit about how these payouts work. Who is actually paying for it?
Yeah, so in NPR's article about the cost of misconduct impacting cities and taxpayers, we learned that insurance policies and city and county budgets usually pay for judgments and claims, right? So jurisdictions hurting for cash will borrow money and issue bonds to spread out payments. So they add bank fees so adding up these bank fees and the interest paid to investors, the costs begin to pile up, and we, the taxpayers, are the ones actually footing the bill for the misconduct. So even when payments are covered by an insurance claim, taxpayers ultimately still pay for those claims and drive up the cost of insurance, this whole thing. So activists argue that tying police misconduct costs to police budgets could help prevent police wrongdoing, which makes sense to me. They also want police officers, especially repeat offenders who cost lots of money, as you were saying, to be financially held accountable. Currently, so-called qualified immunity rules actually shield officers from these costs. That's changed in places like Colorado, where their state representative, Leslie Herod, was the force between the state's decision to drop its qualified immunity provision. Yes, cheers to that.
Yeah.
And some single officers can actually cost millions of dollars. Again, and taxpayers are bearing the brunt of that. Timothy Loman is one of those repeat offenders who has cost taxpayers lots and millions. He is the police officer that shot and killed 12-year-old Tamir Rice in 2014. And the city paid out $6 million for that. Plus, he has continued to get rehired in multiple other police departments, was a whole another issue in and of itself. But it's just a vicious cycle that keeps going.
Yeah, so these repeat offenders, they create harm and then we have to pay for it and they just kind of get reassigned and they get to continue this cycle. Wow.
Yeah.
Hey, wow. Thank you for breaking it down, Bree.
Yeah. And so to dig a bit more into it, what does defunding the police mean for us? And why does it need to happen?
Ooh, there's so many reasons why it needs to happen. But, I want to just take a step back and possibly share a bit of a neutral voice in this. So Vox, I don't know if you keep up with this, Bree, or any of our followers keep up with Vox News. They had this wonderful article titled Police Reform, Defunding, and Abolition Explained. They did a really comprehensive job of partitioning the debate into two main categories, abolitionists and reformers. Today, we want to center their framing of the abolitionist approach and their demands. So they write that abolitionists demand an entirely new public safety system based on social and economic equity. And this is bolstered by a network of nonviolent emergency responders. And abolitionists really offering more than a different vision of public safety. It's truly offering a different vision, I should say, for the composition and the fundamental assumptions of our society. So defunding is really just a small part of this, but it really seeks to really transform how we understand what justice is, how we understand what safety is, how we understand what our communities are, and how we can actually maintain those communities. So with that said, in essence, defunding really exists as a whole suite of public policy ideas premised on investments in individual well-being, community infrastructure, alternative first responder sources and services, and truly divestment from use of lethal force, right? Yeah. This is really important in thinking about Black liberation and the origins of the police as it relates to white supremacy and slavery. And with that said, I think it's really important to lift up the Caribbean scholar Ronaldo Walcott, because he has this brilliant short text. It's maybe 90 pages long. It's titled On Property, a brilliant abolitionist text. And he writes in that abolition truly refuses the inevitability of our present organization of human life. The idea of abolition is a significant and important challenge to the world as we have come to know it, to experience it, and more importantly, how we imagine it going forward. So
that imagination is crucial.
Yes, it really is. I find that's a big roadblock when folks often hear this idea of defunding the police. There's often so many myths that come flooded in when you even suggest that.
Yeah.
So with that said, I'm curious, Bree, if you could share just some of the myths that come up most often when we discuss defunding the police.
Yeah, so maybe it's the same for you, but I feel like the first one I always hear is our first myth, which is that defunding will lead to disorder. This is a common misconception, that police forces are what maintain order in the first place, and that defunding them will lead to total chaos and disorder, but that's not true. Critics of the police movement assert that we need heavily funded and armed police forces to protect the public from violent criminal elements. However, there's not sufficient data to support that position at all. In fact, research has found that police don't have a notoriously efficient track record of solving violent crime in the first place. So just to throw some numbers out there to make it, stick, 70% of robberies, 66% of rapes, 47% of aggravated assaults, and 38% of murders go unsolved every year. So that's huge. And the police aren't really doing what we've been taught and told that they do. So in addition to this, a separate Washington Post article cited that 60 years of data indicates that increases in this police budget spending does not reduce crime. So we're dealing with the same things for 60 years. Abolitionist demands for defunding the police don't just emphasize expanding social programs and investments, but also removing money from police departments. Abolitionists argue that the ballooning police budgets in reality are actually fueling violence and corruption further, right? Because if they know they're going to get more money to keep killing us and doing all these things, why wouldn't they continue to? Money is the incentive, right?
Yeah.
So advocates like the Center of Popular Democracy's Kumar R. Argues that police departments run on a broken financial feedback loop, where after poorly policing communities of color, they run up huge legal fees for abuse, torture, unjust killings, and then the departments are essentially rewarded with larger budgets the next year. Like we said, it's a funding, a cycle of violence. Yeah. And so abolitionist author William C. Anderson has a great response to the myth of a disordered world without police in his essay, which is called The Case for Delegitimizing the Police. He writes, quote, "We can't say a world without police wouldn't work when the places that supposedly need police have never received adequate resources to thrive."
Wow.
And that's the word.
That is so powerful. Thank you for sharing that, Bree. So
Yeah.
ostensibly, like it's almost like financially lucrative for these police departments to commit abuse on minority communities because it directly leads back to more funding for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just hard not to think about like recent comments from Joe Biden, like reiterating, like, no, make no mistake, we actually are going to fund the police.
Yeah.
And, almost like as if that's a response to everything that happened during the summer of 2020. Thank you for uplifting that.
Yeah, for sure. And so bringing it all back to abolition, as always, as Push Black does, we want to raise some questions just to our audience. If y'all want to answer these, you can drop them in the comments and we'll read them aloud. But we want to know what could our communities achieve if we reallocated police funding? And for y'all individually and specifically, I know somebody is joining us from Albany, New York. What resources would you like to see better funded in your own community? Drop a comment and let us know. And we're going to keep going. Darren, speaking of abolition, what are some of those abolitionist alternatives to policing that we should know about?
Well, that's a great question, because as we know, this country really relies way too heavily on the police for unrelated services. And the stats that you mentioned earlier, the services that they're most known for, like solving crimes and whatnot, they actually aren't that great at doing, right?
Right.
Crimes. So with that said, thinking about other alternatives, I want to lift up this quote from activist Tingy McHarris from the Movement for Black Lives and also self-proclaimed abolitionists. And they state quite clearly that we need alternatives to policing. If someone is sleeping on a bench, if there's a mental health issue, policing is the one tactic, and as we know, it's often a failed tactic, used in our communities for the range of needs that our people actually have. Now, I think a great recent example of the over-reliance on policing to actually treat social iniquities and social problems really comes out of the Missouri legislature. Because recently, just this month, they passed a decision to criminalize, listen to this, Bree, they decided to criminalize sleeping on state properties, such as sleeping beneath overpasses, parks, sidewalks, things of that nature, right? Yeah. Now, even former NYPD sergeant from the Burlington Police Chief, his name is Brandon Del Pozo, he even asked, right, why are we still asking the police as untrained interventionists to deal with people who are overdosing, using drugs, or as barely trained crisis interventionists to deal with mental health, when we can piggyback, or more importantly, create separate apparatuses that can truly handle that for us. Yeah. Now, abolitionists have openly demanded at least rerouting 50% of the police budgets to other civil services. And another defund advocate I'd like to lift up here, Illinois State Senator Robert Peters, stated to Vox News that folks often get caught up in this, oh my gosh, man, to defund the police. But what people really need to know here is that there's a whole other host of demands that are attached to defunding, which are truly about uplifting the community, right? So it's not just like tearing something down. It's about what do we want to build and its replacement to truly make it obsolete.
Yeah.
Now, another feature or another alternative, right, to policing is truly decriminalization, right? It's another important feature of the abolitionist vision. So abolitionists truly believe that the war on drugs in and of itself is racist and just totally ineffective. We should just simply end it. And if we do end it, would it make sense for police budgets, which have been ballooned because of this war on drugs, to actually be cut, right?
Right.
So after we did a little bit of research, we came across Alex Vitale, this wonderful sociologist, who wrote this text I want to recommend to everyone here, titled The End of Policing. And in this text, he really detailed how Portugal, from 1999 to 2009, they successfully decriminalized drug use by handing over drug harm reduction to health officials. And by doing that, they were effectively treating this as a health problem, which it is.
Yeah.
So Vitale writes about Portugal in 1999. Portugal actually had the highest rate of HIV infection among injecting drug users in the entire European Union. However, by 2009, because they decriminalized drug use, right? Treated it as a health issue. By 2009, the number of newly diagnosed HIV cases among drug users had decreased substantially. So following this up, the New York Times actually did a report on this, and the New York Times is not too sympathetic to defunding the police, but they had a very interesting take on the decriminalization of drugs in Portugal. So this journalist, Nicholas Christoph, he actually found that the number of heroin users there fell by 3/4, and the overdose fatality rate was actually the lowest in Western Europe. Right. So at one time they were like the highest amount in like the European Union, but after this process, they were the lowest in all of Western Europe. Now compare this to the US. Christoph wrote, meanwhile, after decades of policing, the US was losing about 70,000 people a year from overdoses. Yeah, he ends his piece writing, in effect, Portugal appeared to be winning the war on drugs by ending it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Straight like that. I mean, this is like proof. People that want to deny like abolition and defunding the police, always asking for proof. This is proof. It has worked in plenty of other places, and we can take those steps too.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. So with that said, I want to kind of dig back into some of the barriers, some of the myths that holds people back from truly kind of embracing the abolitionist vision. Bree, do you have any kind of more common myths that arise when we talk about defunding the police?
Yes. So another common myth, our second one of tonight, is that most police work is focused on crime prevention. That is a myth. So the motto that we've all heard, is to protect and serve, right? This was actually first coined by the Los Angeles Police Department in the 50s, and it's been widely adopted by police departments everywhere. So what exactly is a police officer's legal obligation to protect people? There's actually minimal evidence that inflated police budgets result in reduced crime or preventing crime. So they don't really have to protect and serve us. It's just a saying, right? And so, like the recent tragedy in Uvalde, Texas, coupled with multiple Supreme Court rulings determining that police have no duty actually to protect, it crystallizes for us that there's little correlation between public safety and policing. So for example, police funding makes up 40% of Uvalde's budget, and the school district itself had their own police force. And yet this tragedy still occurred. And I think that says a lot. So think of this in relation to the recent decision by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit, upholding a lower court ruling that police cannot be held liable for failing to protect students in the 2018 shooting that claimed 17 lives in Parkland, Florida. Wow. So these events, beg us to question the function, or rather the legitimacy, right, of the police. Who and what do they serve? Because it ain't us. And again, we would like to lift up Renato Walcott's On Property. And if you're interested in learning more about abolitionists' answer to that question.
Yes, indeed. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's really, really disturbing. So the Supreme Court ruled that they actually don't have to do the job and the model that they've been like living off of for so long, which,
yeah.
okay.
It's just a motto. It's not, it's what we've all been with made to believe, and it's worked because we believe it, you know, media reinforces it, all the departments have adopted it.
Yeah,
But
yeah. Wow.
it ain't
Ooh,
true.
it's yeah, the numbers show that it's not true. They're not
Yeah.
solving the crimes. They actually commit more violence and they're solving at least more funding for them. And now the Supreme Court is saying that they actually don't have to protect and serve. So what do they do? Mm,
Waste our money
yes.
and kill us. Um,
Yes.
so we'll bring it back to abolition. And Darren, can you drop another myth on us?
You know, a big refrain that kind of comes up is very subtle, but it's almost like this subtle ideology that kind of belies this pushback against defunding the police. And it's really the myth that community programs just won't work. Now, I don't know about you, Bree, but I really find that much of that myth relies on this idea that we just can't trust one another, right?
Yeah.
And that we don't have whole and stable communities. And truly, I truly believe that this idea that community programs just won't work to keep us safe, it really dissolves community bonds that we've had for millennia before the introduction of this colonial state that we live in now.
Yeah.
So just to think about some of the community programs that actually have worked, I want to lift up the interrupters. Bree, have you ever heard about the interrupters at all?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so there's a wonderful documentary about the interrupters that was released in 2009, directed by Steve James, director of so very much interested in Chicago. And
Mhm.
the Interrupters was a community program in South and West Side Chicago made up of former gang members who are actually tapped to intervene or interrupt in
Mm.
potential kind of violent incidents that could potentially happen in their own communities. So for instance, if they receive word that there may be some retaliatory violence that may happen, or if there may be potential for violence to happen on their own block, these folks with their own actual knowledge, lived experience, their own background, were able to come in and resolve this through community conversations. And I just found that fascinating. Now, they actually received quite a bit of funding from the city of Chicago to do this, but that
Yeah.
funding was actually cut short just a handful of years ago. So that's just one idea for community programs that could actually be an alternative to actually having the police not do their jobs, right? Uh,
Yeah.
but with that said, you know, I just want to state also that much of the available research actually contradicts this idea or this narrative that policing is essential to eliminating crime. While on the other hand, there's substantial evidence that shows that investing, developing, and supporting education and economic programs do in fact lead to less offenses and create more social harmony.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with that said, you know, I want to raise this question and kind of harkens back to the older question I just raised a few minutes ago. But for our folks joining us for this conversation, what community programs would you actually like to see? So it could be, again, thinking about underfunded resources, but maybe there isn't an institution, or organization, or a resource that doesn't exist that you would actually like to see developed.
Yeah.
Uh, Reflect on that, drop a comment.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Darren. I love, us wrapping up on the community aspect because I think it's really important, like you said, to like not forget that we've always been like a communal people, like way
Mm,
before policing and all of this existed. Like that's who we are. We've always relied on each other, and we can do that in this way too, you know? Um,
yes.
so I love that. Thanks everyone for joining us. We want to just wrap it up by saying, defunding is only a small piece of abolition. No correlation between police funding and public safety, especially as police have proven to be public danger, exists. So abolitionists have a different view of what causes crime. In the world they imagine, America would spend much more time on education, healthcare, and infrastructure, and nothing on police departments as we currently know them. And that's what we would like to see happen. So thanks so much for joining us, for engaging, and we can't wait to do another one soon. I think we'll be back next week. So
Yes, yes. Thank y'all so much. I'm Bree. I'm sorry, I'm Darren.
this is Bree. This is Darren. Nah, thank
Thank
y'all.
y'all so much. We'll see you next week, y'all.
All right, bye.
Peace.